Good afternoon, at least from here, from Rome. Good morning for some participants like Jane. Good morning, everybody. So this is the it's actually the third session of this year annual meeting of the IGAD community. I don't know if you all know IGAD. IGAD is now called the Improving Global Agricultural Data Community of Practice under the Research Data Alliance. It used to be called IGAD, but it had a different meaning. It was the interest group of agricultural data. Now we are a community of practice. A community of practice, it's actually the first community of practice in the Research Data Alliance. And it basically gathers all people, practitioners, people working on data in the agricultural community. So working on food and agriculture topics. And it's the third year that we organize an annual meeting. And in the annual meeting, there are several sessions on different topics. And the topic for today is ethical and legal issues around agricultural data. We already had a session on the same topic this morning, part 1, with Markus Schmidt. And he will give you a summary of that session. And now we are having the same topic, but with a slightly different, I will tell you more later, a slightly different angle. Just before we go into the session, let me just give you a very, very quick, let's say, tour of housekeeping rules. It's not really rules. It's a few people, so it's a very informal meeting. Just keep muted if possible if you're not speaking. If you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand. We will have questions after the talks, but also there will be a discussion at the end where you can ask more questions. And the questions can be asked in the chat or here, directly raising your hand. The meeting is being recorded. I'll give you, of course, give us some information about you when you ask the questions, just to know where you are from and from which organization you are. And the meeting is being recorded, and we will send the link to the recording to everybody, to all the participants. So this is the program of this year's annual meeting. As you see, we are at the 4th session, although one has been postponed to August, the 3rd one. And there will be 2 more after this one. There is a QR code, and you can still register for the last ones. Today, what do we have today? So this is the topic, and the speakers are Gerard Sylvester, Jane Ezirigwe, I hope I'm pronouncing it well, and Dominic Bednarczyk. The speakers will, okay, you will hear from Markus what we discussed in the morning. Today, what we are going to do is we are going to look into data governance issues and data governance challenges, and how these data governance challenges affect small-scale producers, indigenous people, and Jane will speak more in general about power imbalances. We will, you can find the bios of the speakers in the program here at this link. And then let's just give the floor to Markus to give us a short summary of what happened today. Markus, you can tell me to go ahead with your slides. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Valeria. So some of you were actually here this morning or in Europe this morning, and we had an interesting session about legal and ethical issues from 2 different angles. So one was given by Gabi Serregra on industry adoption of the Australian Farm Data Code and data sharing agreement. So more from a practice perspective. And the second one was given by my colleague Nikolai Svoboda and me about legal and ethical concerns during the data lifecycle from the perspective of the Fair Agro Data Steward Service Center. So Fair Agro is a research data consortium in Germany on the domain of agricultural data. And the Data Steward Service Center is going to be a point of contact for anyone having any questions within the domain about any part of the research data lifecycle from data collection up to data publication. So on the next slide, we quickly summarize what these talks presented. These different talks presented challenges of farm data by Gabi, where it was about the availability versus control of your own data from the perspective of the farmer, and really showed that very importantly, there needs to be, and there is a growing awareness of farmers about their own data. And from the Australian Farm Data Code, they're really trying to get the message across that it's their data. So basically it's their rules, and it's even possible. It should be possible at any time to control the data, get access to the data, and also be able to say, please delete my data. And then Nikolai and me, we talked about the challenges in agricultural research data. And from the perspective of a data steward, that early on you keep an open eye on when you get in data or get a data request. Is there any personal data involved, geodata involved that cannot be shown the way it is and maybe needs to be anonymized? And is there a high data quality? We later also talked about that it's important not only to have maybe automatic checks for data quality, but also to have a person really reviewing the data who has expertise in the field. And we also saw that there are different scales of issues in legal and ethical ways, and they might not be the same from data set to project to repo to national and international scales, and they all hold their different issues and questions. Okay, can you please go on, Valeria? Then in the open panel discussion, we had Gabi Serega, Stefan Lesch, and Nikolai Svoboda. And I had asked in advance for all of them to give a vision about how what they see as very important for data. So Gabi's vision was that people would have ownership of their own data without depending on other parties. Stefan talked about the vision of data being shared just as much as we share published papers, so that this goes along and there's really more credit for scientists to share their data. And Nikolai was talking about a cultural change towards awareness that sharing and reusing data is common and part of a good scientific practice. And we later talked, and he also stated that really, if you set up a data policy for your project, that in the end, you will actually really profit from that. So to have clear rules. Okay, and then as the last slide, I put together some information, what we talked about, because you may later want to research some of it. I have a link to the Australian Farm Data Code, to the Fair Agro Consortium on agricultural data, the Bonneris repository, where anyone is invited to submit soil and agricultural data to be published, also with the DOI, and the EDAFO base, which Stefan is part of, which is a data infrastructure on soil animals. And now after this, I will put these links in the chat so that you can also look at them whenever you like. So I think that's it from my part. Thank you very much. And I am looking forward to a very nice session. Thank you, Valeria. Thank you, Marcus.
So in the morning, it was more about open data platforms and farm data code of conduct. Now in this session, we're going a little beyond exploring challenges of data governance that affect actually small-scale farmers, that affect indigenous people, and also, as Jane will show us, that affect power imbalances. So I will first give the floor to Gerard Sylvester. He will present on the importance of data governance for smallholder farmers. Gerard, I will stop sharing and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Valeria, for this opportunity, and hello, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Let me share my screen and let me know if you're able to see my screen.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. No, I mean, I was happy to hear the gist of what happened in the morning. Sounds like a very interesting session, and probably I'll go back to have a look at some of the recordings. And I was really happy to hear what Marcus was presenting, because what I'm going to talk about or share is going to build on what was discussed in the morning. Now, as we know, digital plays a very significant role in trying to bridge several gaps that we see in agriculture, right from bridging the agricultural extension gap into trying to bring together early warning systems, to being able to link smallholder farmers to newer markets. When I say able to link to new markets, it also gives them the capacity to kind of on-field value addition, to bring in a component of traceability, and several other things. So without digital technologies, you wouldn't be able to do most of these things. And one of the key benefits that smallholder farmers can get is from getting connected through digital financial services. So financial inclusion is a game changer for smallholder farmers. So digital plays a huge accelerator role when it comes to smallholder farmers, and digitizing for agriculture has a lot of benefits. Now, while we talk about the importance of digitizing, we also need to have a look at what are the challenges that lies. And one of the challenges, let's take Africa, for example. 30% of the rural population cannot access the internet. And we know what these 30% would be involved in. They'd be involved in agriculture and allied activities, right? And 18% of the rural population has no mobile network coverage. On the whole, globally, we say that almost 93% of the population lives in an area where there's some sort of a network connectivity, 2G or 3G, some sort of network connectivity. So again, 2.9 billion people are still offline. 96% of that is in developing countries. So huge gaps in terms of connectivity still remains. And then the other challenge that we often overlook, or we tend not to look, is the gender digital divide. When we're talking about connectivity, we talk about farmers having access to mobiles. We are talking about the men having access to mobiles, not the women. Because in a rural community, in a household in a rural community, there will be one mobile phone. If at all it's a smartphone, there's one smartphone. And who has access to that? It's the men who have access to it. And then we say that 50% of the agricultural workforce is women. And then we try to develop all kinds of apps and everything to deliver agricultural advisories and share information through mobile phones, which means you're leaving out the 50%. So all these basic or not basic, glaring gaps remain when we're talking about the lack of data which is there in agriculture. Because that's a prelude to what I'm going to talk about. If you have good quality real-time data, then you'll be able to build something significant. You'll be able to come up with data-driven policies. But then if you have glaring gaps from the places where you're supposed to collect data, then we need to fix that before we move on to the next aspect. Now, so what are the biggest challenges when it comes to smallholders adopting digital? We see that smallholders have a very low adoption rate. Digital divide, digital inclusion, and the gender component plays a huge role. And when it comes to smallholder agriculture, the levels and linkages that exist in the rural milieu plays a major role. A farmer is not going to trust an SMS that he gets on his mobile phone to change the way he does his farming, because he doesn't trust that message. Trust comes from a human face. And then that levels and linkages that exist in rural areas are one of the strongest networks that the farmer has in trying to have access to his knowledge and everything. So how can digital technologies work together with existing levels and linkages to move the digital ecosystem along? Age of farmers, again, average age of farmers is anywhere between 55 to 69, Japan 69. So it's a bit difficult for farmers who are little old to uptake digital technologies. Now, when we're talking about digital technologies, there's also a need for capacity development at all levels, right from the rural areas up to the people in the agricultural ministry and everyone in between. Because we're talking about something new, there's new ways of doing things, and we need to make sure that there is a significant capacity to absorb and adopt and use these technologies. And investing in ICT infrastructure should be more affordable and actionable. Only then the adoption of digital services and digital technologies will be mainstream. Now, coming back to the main topic of digitization and the data. So digitizing the value chain and its actors is a prerequisite for digital solutions implementation. So how do you bring in people in the rural community into a digital ecosystem, into a data ecosystem, so that you're able to have data? Only when you have data, we can talk about the great things that we talk about, data governance and several other things. So to facilitate and to create the data ecosystem, you need to bring in something called as a data for services ecosystem. Like I always say, you say data is the new oil. So if you're taking oil from a farmer, from a smallholder, or from anyone, you pay him for that oil. I use Google services. I use all sorts of Google services. I don't pay anything. Instead of that, for that particular service, I share my data. I review a restaurant. I review a particular historic places that I visit. So Google gets access to my data, and then in turn, he gives me a service. Now, we need to be able to replicate this paradigm for smallholder farmers, for agriculture. When you do that, the whole system moves from a linear to a circular economy, circular model. Because when you're talking about data, a smallholder farmer is one data point. Rather than we talk about a value chain approach, it starts from the rural community, it starts from the farmer, and then it goes to the consumer. So you have a linear, okay? When you talk about data, it goes into more of a circular. So then you need to talk about data governance, the privacy. Who do you, if you're collecting smallholder data, who you're going to share it with, how long you're going to keep it with, right? All those things. And the security related to the data governance is very, very important when you're talking about smallholder data. Then coming back to, again, the data for services, what is the incentive for sharing data? We keep talking about we don't have access to good quality data. There's huge programs, even for agriculture, which is the global program for agricultural statistics, where we're trying to help governments to collect good quality data. Only if you have good quality data can you come up with innovative, smart services. And then you need to be able to reuse building blocks. A lot of these countries have registration data in terms of the profile of citizens. We need to be able to have these systems talk to existing systems so that you can extract value from data. When you combine 2-3 different data sources, the value of the data increases manifold. But now what happens is most of the systems are in isolation. So it increases the cost of having good quality data. So once you have good quality data, you're able to set up a data ecosystem where you're able to collect data from the rural community. Then we talk about the public sector. What can the public sector do with the data? Then that's where you talk about big data analytics. And this will be very helpful for governments to be able to come up with data-driven policies. One example is where in Indonesia, they're trying to set up what they call it as an agricultural war room. It's a center where you have data coming in from various sources. It's all run through a knowledge layer, and then you're able to extract intelligence. And based on that intelligence, you know what sort of interventions you have to do, or if you have to tweak some policies to make sure that it reaches the intended beneficiary, you can do that. And all that is possible if you have good quality data. So then if you, going from the previous point of data for services, you can also build what you call it as data as a service ecosystem. Once you have data, then you can sell the data to various stakeholders who can benefit from the data. Again, respecting the data governance related conditions and frameworks. You don't identify people, but you can give information that will be helpful. An example is the Aadhaar from India, which is one of the biggest biometric database in the world, where every citizen is registered on the database. So you have all his fingerprints and biometrics and all kinds of data. Few years back, if you had to go and pick up a mobile SIM card, you need to give all sorts of details, your passport, your ID card and everything. Now, when you go to pick up a SIM card, you fill up a form and then you say that I am Gerard Sylvester, right? And then there is a small place where you put your finger and then it sends a query to the main database, the Aadhaar database, saying that, is this person who he claims to be? And the system responds back with a yes or a no. So you already get authenticated from the huge database which the government has set up. And then you can build as kind of a membership-based kind of a service where you are able to get revenue into the data ecosystem, which can then be shared across people in the data ecosystem. You should also be able to harness data from non-traditional data sources. And this was very useful during COVID, where people were migrating from the cities towards the villages, and there was no real information of who's going where. People were able to use the mobile movement pattern, the cell tower pattern, and map how many people are moving towards a particular area, how many people are moving away from the city to which area. And this was helpful to predict where the next COVID hotspot was and where you can put your social distancing and other sorts of things, which was really helpful during this time. So what is needed to make sure that this happens? One is we need to make sure that we invest in hard infrastructure, which is interoperability between mobile networks, mobile services, and various components like IoT service providers and network service providers. Soft infrastructure, investment in soft infrastructure, which is like the e-government's frameworks and services. Unfortunately, the e-government and data governance framework in many countries are not at the level that they should be at. If you look at Europe, you have the GDPR. We need to have similar arrangements in many countries. Again, GDPR and these are policies and frameworks, but then you also have to have the teeth to make sure that these are implemented and enforced upon. The policy is a policy, but then you need to have implementation mechanisms to make sure that people are staying in line. Interoperability between different platforms, and that's something that I was telling earlier. Systems existing in silos, those days are over. You need to be able to make sure that systems talk to each other so that we can extract intelligence from various data sources. Partnership is very important. And then economies of scale and scope. No, this is a very interesting point. Collecting data is extremely expensive. If you talk to any startups or any sorts of agencies, they will say that 80% of the cost goes into data collection and acquisitions. So if there is, maybe it's a public sector or someone who's able to invest in collecting this data, all the frameworks respected, then you can be able to monetize the data and then you'll be able to scale it up. So the cost of data acquisition goes away for most of these innovative service providers, these startups. They can focus on their service delivery. They can focus on their innovation. I think I've already covered most of this. So the regulatory framework, legal framework has to be put in place, should be very strong in terms of data governance, infrastructure in terms of the partnership between various national players to facilitate data interoperability should be there. Capacity, I mean, I cannot stress this enough. We are talking about something new, which we haven't spoken about in the last 20 years. So data and digital and everything, the talk of all this has spurred in the last 10 years, which needs new capacities, right from the agricultural ministry down to the people in the rural areas. So we need to focus on capacity building. Human capital is very important when it comes to digital services onboarding and talking about data ecosystem. Policies. What are the incentives for people to uptake digital currency? What is the incentives for people to engage in a digital ecosystem? We saw during COVID, a lot of countries built things on mobile money and non-touch based payments, QR codes and all those things. But the moment you saw a little bit of COVID receding, people ran back to physical currency, because there's a comfort in holding currencies and exchanging coins. And so how can you incentivize people to move away from that into a digital where then you can build a lot of these smart services. Okay, with Valeria's permission, I'll make a small plug here. We have an event in the Near East. It will be in Amman, which will be focusing on digital agricultural solutions. So if anyone is interested to attend, participate, do write to me, or you can just look it up and register. Thank you, Valeria. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Gerard. Thank you very much. I have a lot of questions actually, but I would first give the possibility to other participants to ask a question. Otherwise, I have a question for you. Does anybody in the audience want to ask something? Okay, my question is quite obvious to you. You work for the investment center in FAO. So my first question would be, all that you say is very ambitious. I mean, to do things well, you need money, you need funds. So how do you see what type of investment would you need, and what is needed, and how can you make it happen? Let's say, how can FAO or other institutions make it happen regarding funding?
Yeah, no, of course, investments is a huge discussion. And what we are trying to do is to first impress upon governments on the importance of thinking of data governance before you start doing many things. Normally, what people do is that data governance becomes an afterthought. You collect a lot of data and then you say, oh, we have to do data governance, and then you try to put something there to. No, that's not the way it should be done. In fact, I was challenging some of our colleagues when they said that digital literacy 10 years ago meant something else. Whether you're able to switch on a smartphone, or you're able to install an app, or you're able to go on your YouTube. Now my grandmother uses YouTube comfortably. So digital literacy is not your comfort with a smartphone. Digital literacy is the ability to understand why you're collecting my data. What are you going to do with that? Asking the right questions related to data. That's digital literacy. That's what we need to impress upon countries and other organizations. That if you go to many mobile operators, they have a service which is catering towards agriculture stakeholders. They would have registered 10,000 farmers, 20,000 farmers, and they are happy to share that data with you for some partnership. They say, let's work together. I have data of 20,000 farmers, right? So they use that as a bargaining tool. And the person from who he collected the data has no idea on how his data is being used or misused in many instances. So impressing upon governments the need to invest in data governance framework. That's number one. And like I said, it needs huge amount of capacities, because we are talking about a concept that didn't exist 10 years ago, or at least wasn't that serious. So we need to impress upon countries on the importance of data governance, and then data literacy. That's very important. And the third is on data infrastructure. How can you make, like I said, interoperable services, both hard and soft? How can you work on that to be able to interoperate, make sure that services are interoperable? So all these things together kind of needs a huge investments and capacity. Valeria, thanks.
Thank you, Gerard. Yeah, there will be, actually, we should talk much more about this topic in terms of investment, what is needed. We can continue the conversation later. Thank you very much. So now we can move to the next presenter. Let me show Jane. Jane Ezirigwe. Jane will present on power contestations in the use of agri-food data towards a sustainability governance approach. Jane, the floor is yours. I will share the presentation.
Yeah, I can actually share. I can share from my end if you enable me to.
You want to try?
Yes, please.
Okay, you try.
Okay. I hope you can see me now.
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everybody, once again. Again, my name is Jane Ezirigwe, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Open Air Network at the University of Ottawa. For my postdoc, I'm researching broadly on global governance of food and agricultural data. It's a work in progress. I'm being supervised by Professors Jeremy Debier and Chidi Ogwamanam. And I have a working draft as part of my research under the postdoctoral fellowship, and that's part of what I'm sharing with you today. And so when we talk about negotiating a framework for the governance of food and agricultural data, I want you to wonder what kind of actors you would expect to see on the negotiating table. And I'm going to give you about 5 seconds and invite you to use your mind's eye to think about some of the actors you expect to see on the negotiating table if we're going to design a governance framework on the use and generation of agri-food data. Okay, and so I assume that some of the actors you see on my screen now are some of the actors you thought about, and some others, for some people, it may be surprising that some of the people you see at the left-hand side of the screen would need to be at the negotiating table with some of the corporate guys we see on the other side. And that is what my presentation is all about. What kind of power dynamics do we see play out in the industry? And how can we respond to this realization while we are trying to design a framework on the governance of food and agricultural data? So by way of an outline, I'm going to introduce some concepts. I'm going to discuss 5 dimensions that we could use to see how power plays out in the agri-food sector. I'm going to look at the implications on governance before I conclude the presentation. So as a problem statement, I would like us to remember that we have a twin challenge of overpopulation and climate change. And in response to that, stakeholders have been looking at how do we maximize productivity and profit and still feed 8 billion people on Earth and deal with climate change challenges. And digital agriculture has been promoted as a panacea that could help in achieving these. Now, digital agriculture, like Gerard had laid the foundation, is the use of digital and data management tools and technologies to help to make decisions on food production, livestock, and production patterns. And so while we promote digital agriculture and while it's being advocated by a lot of stakeholders, we're also mindful of the fact that its potential benefits are there, but there are also some potential threats and consequences that could arise from the use of digital agriculture. And one of such consequences is inequities and inequalities that we see that can be exacerbated with the use of digital agriculture in the sector, and we'll come to that in a moment. And so because of this realization, we need to be very mindful when we are thinking about the governance of agri-food data. The data that is generated with the digital and in the use of digital agriculture should be governed in such ways that the gains of digital agriculture is evenly distributed to all the stakeholders. And when I talk about agri-food data here, I want you to know that I'll be talking about both the farm and off-farm data, the digital sequence information, and all the data points you see in the food value chain. The data points generate data, and I'm interested in all of that. The data we generate even during transportation, during labeling, during even with the way the consumers buy food products, the kind of data points that are put in the whole value chain. It's the whole data that I'll be talking about. And in thinking in that direction, I want you to know that it's projected that very soon, each farm unit will be producing about 4.9 million data points. And so when we're talking about data, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. That's just one farm unit producing this multiple data points and putting it into the pool. Now think about the whole food and agricultural value chain, then you know the kind of data we're talking about. And when I talk about power dynamics, I'm talking about dominant positions, unequal opportunities, inequities, and inequalities that exist while we continue to support the system of digital agriculture as it is at the moment. And so, I would try to discuss the 5 dimensions that we see power play out in the agri-food sector. The first dimension is on agenda setting. And so when it comes to agenda setting, what we see is that transnational actors, including international governmental organizations, like the Food and Agriculture, where Gerard came from, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, all these international governmental organizations, including NGOs, big corporations, activist networks, just transnational actors who are in dominant positions or in positions of authority or in position of influence, are driving a narrative that digital agriculture is the answer to high productivity and profit in the sector. Now, we're not disputing that fact. We're just emphasizing the fact that the reality is that these narratives are being pushed in the mainstream discourse, and the fact that it's affecting and influencing the consciousness of stakeholders in the sector, and may influence people's response to it, either to adopt it or go along with it. But for whatever reason, the point is that there is a power play there with the people in a dominant position driving a narrative. And we also see it with governments, national governments also investing, now jumping in to invest huge amounts of money. The EU, we see it, they have initiatives that promote digital agriculture. The US, Japanese government, the Horizon Initiative, and all of that, they are all trying to promote digital agriculture as an answer or as a way to help increase productivity in the sector. That's not a bad thing. We're just saying it's existing there. Now, the second dimension will be in technology development and deployment. So whatever data we generate starts with the technology that is put in place to generate that data. And so in developing and deploying technology, we should be careful about biases and discrimination, so that technology is not developed in such a way that it generates data that we now take decisions on those data, but the ideologies and interests of those that develop the technology and deploy it is being perpetuated or being driven home. And so some examples will be in the area of gender, like Gerard also flagged. So if gender dimensions are not taken into consideration, we will find out that women will be left out, the needs of women will be left out in the development and deployment of technology. And we've seen that happen. There are evidences and examples where, because the scientific and management teams of these technology companies are made up of men, you find out that the idea of a farmer that is being, that the technologies are being designed for is a male farmer, and sometimes even a male white farmer who has access to a huge parcel of land, as against the reality of, for example, women smallholder farmers in Africa who have access to small holdings and who practice mixed farming. But these technologies are developed having in mind that most of the farmers will do monocropping and all of that. And so that is another area where we see power play out. Again, most of the technologies are developed to support resource-intensive agriculture. But then it leaves out those that practice, for example, regenerative agriculture or agroecology, or natural farming, as some other people will call it, who are not interested in resource-intensive agriculture. Now, the third dimension is on politics of knowledge and evidence. And so we know that science produces knowledge, produces the evidence of how we take decisions or believe in the true situation of things. But the politics of GMOs have also shown us that the same science can be used to arrive at different conclusions depending on the ideology of who is conducting the research or funding the research. And so we see, for example, in the case of GMOs, where the EU, using the same science, will arrive at a different precautionary measures, while the US doesn't see the harms or threats that are being alluded to by the EU. And so if we know that science is not value-free and ideologies could influence the outcomes of science and the data that is generated from it, then we see that there could be some power play in what is presented to us in evidence to support scientific processes. So for example, we see Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation supporting agriculture in Africa and providing a lot of grants and assistance, but then they are promoting, again, resource-intensive agriculture as against agroecology. And based on the facts, on the data that they produce, they continue to, suppress local knowledge because they are the ones on ground producing this evidence, and then kind of neglecting these marginal agricultural practices and making them to be overlooked and misunderstood, as the case may be. And the fourth dimension will be on hegemonic alliances. And so with the realization that data is power, it's the new oil, Gerard has also alluded to what kind of values we would get from data. Big data agricultural companies are beginning to merge in order to maximize and have more access to multiple data points in the value chain. So we see mergers from Bayer and Monsanto, we see DuPont and that skipped my mind, Heinz and Crafts. We see some mergers in with those that work traditionally in the agri-food sector, but we're also seeing some mergers and strategic alliances with non-traditional agricultural companies like Google, Amazon, Alibaba, also venturing into the sector. In all, they just want to assume the dominant positions and drive their interests, as the case may be. And then finally, we'll look at harvesting data and value. And in this, the main issue with harvesting data and value is with regards to who has access to the data and who controls the use of the data. And so, unfortunately, what we see there is that the big corporations, who are the ones that design and produce the technology used to generate this data, control the access to the data. They have lock-in terms where they force the farmers to remain in their services and have them repair their machines and equipment with them, have them not be able to transfer their data if they want to leave the service, and all those unfair terms in the contract. But the point is that dominant position helps them dictate who has access to the data. And then again, what Gerard alluded to, the capacity to extract value from the data is usually by these dominant positioned companies as against the small holder farmers. And so what are the implications of these on governance? And I would want to ask, why should we care? We should care because we have some global commitments on SDGs where global leaders and the whole global community has committed to leaving no one behind. And so if we're going to leave no one behind, and international law has the moral duty and the ability to correct some of these imbalances, then we should seek to do that. The second reason why we should do that is because of system sustainability. So if we refuse to acknowledge these power imbalances and try to redistribute the benefits of digital agriculture, we're going to see that if farmers may protest and if the farmers pull out from the system of using digital agriculture. It's going to affect the kind of data and how we are able to generate data that sustains the system. The last reason why we should care is because if we don't, again, we would have to have limited people join in the governance processes, participatory processes, and what to mean is that we'll have a skewed governance regime in favor of the big multinationals. But then how should we care? We should care by insisting on inclusion. Inclusion means we should think about the needs of these marginal actors and try to bring in their needs in all the 5 dimensions I've talked about. Whether we are developing technology or deploying technology, we are setting an agenda. We shouldn't set an agenda that only promotes resource-intensive agriculture. We should start thinking about how agroecology, for example, could still be used to achieve the high productivity we are talking about. We should also include women and people from sub-Saharan Africa in the discussions on fashioning out a governance framework. Again, we should care by ensuring data trust. And in this regard, I recommend, or I'm part of the school of thought that believes in co-generated data rights as against just giving farmers the rights to own their data. The right to own data given to farmers does not really correct these anomalies, because they could still sell it with unilaterally crafted contracts and all of that. So co-generated, the data is co-generated. It's not generated only by farmers. And so we should build a co-generated data rights where we insist on interoperability, like Gerard said, and but insist on non-waivability of the farmers' rights. This time around, not even farmers' rights, farm units. So if we make sure that we give the rights to farm units as against farmers, then we're sure that even when the, I'm so sorry. That then we're sure that even when a farmer sells its farm units, the rights reside with the farm units, not with the farmer. And then again, we should try to use compensation to redistribute the benefits of digital agriculture by, for example, using the approach of access and benefit sharing that already exists. And so in concluding, I would like us to look at this slide and the 4 squares in it, and then think about the picture we saw at the beginning of the slide and try to put the actors we saw there in the squares. And so we would see that in the first square there, it's obvious that the tree, the way it's positioned, is skewed in favor of the person at my left-hand side. And so no matter how hard this other guy tries, getting the benefits will be more difficult.
Sorry, forgive me, Jane. I think we have to be a little quicker because we have another presentation and then a short discussion.
Okay, that's fine. So I think in summary, the picture speaks for itself. Where we should strive to get to is the picture number 4, where we try to adjust the system in such a way that it works for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. And sorry really for interrupting you, also because I like this picture a lot. You know, we're all familiar with the difference between equity and equality, but I like the addition of justice very much. So we have a question actually in the question and answers box, but I would suggest, since this is a very good question that I think we want to ask to all the speakers, Stephen, you asked this question. May I postpone this question to the final discussion? If I hear no,
yeah,
I just
no problem.
Thank you. So we will ask all the speakers to answer that question, and we will move now to Dominic. Let me share my screen again.
Oh, it's okay. I can share my own slides. I should be good to go.
Yeah, okay. Well, I just wanted to show you your bio, but maybe you can just introduce yourself.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Yes, the floor is yours. You go.
Okay. Oops. Okay, can everybody see my slides perfectly?
Yes.
All right, no technical difficulties. All right. Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Dominic. I'm currently a student at McMaster University. I'm on a co-op. I'm working with World Data Systems, the International Technology Office, on a project that is partnering with Enrich Local Contexts and Dr. Maui Hudson. We are working on a sort of practical application of things that have been discussed earlier in this presentation, and that is how can we apply ethical data standards and data governance and data rights in a practical way. How can just the average person do it, right? When it comes to building this framework. Now, a quick overview about my presentation. I'll be doing a little bit of a background on our organization and our project. Then we'll get into what exactly this solution to the issue is. We'll be speaking specifically about indigenous communities and how to ethically and properly describe their rights when it comes to doing data and research. And then finally, I will do an overview about how anyone can get started and use this tool properly. So before we begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about indigenous data sovereignty. So yes, today and in the past, indigenous communities are rarely recognized as rights holders when it comes to data. Their knowledge and their artifacts can be taken and not given the proper rights and proper ownership to them, and instead it is given to the people that hold it. We'll see an example of this later on in this presentation. But when we talk about indigenous data sovereignty, it is really a discourse about their rights, their treaty rights, their property rights, and their interest in this. And honestly, if you have an interest in indigenous data sovereignty, I would really recommend reading these two papers. They can do the topic much better justice than I can in this presentation. So that is just a little bit of background and context. We'll be moving on. And some of you might have the question about how we can apply this specifically to agriculture. And I found it very interesting when Gerard talked about building a framework for agricultural data. I have a background in biodiversity, and so I'm coming into this with a little bit of an outside perspective. Biodiversity and agriculture are intrinsically linked, but when looking at biodiversity, there are multiple organizations that are beginning to build global data repositories. So anyone around the world can access biodiversity data through one place of storage. And there doesn't seem to be an equivalent for agriculture. Anything that I've found has been federal data stores and so on, which is an interesting difference. And as we're building this framework for a much broader sort of global agricultural data governance, it's important to take into account that agriculture research and data goes back a really long way. And a lot of the storage and research we has was taken from indigenous communities around the world without their without respect, without their consent, and not used properly. So it's important that we take a look back at that, and especially in North America, where I'm from, all of the land that we currently farm on is owned by indigenous peoples and indigenous communities, countless different tribes. So it's important that we take a look at that, and when going forward and looking back, we have the proper ways of using that and representing that in the future. So this project started recently, actually only a couple of years ago, and is still being worked on. It is publicly available, but we're still improving it and trying to make it a global initiative. It started with an interest in biodiversity, and as we are in currently the Anthropocene mass extinction event, where every day species are going extinct, and this is affecting us, our food, and everything we eat. It is the perfect time to kind of unite and take in all perspectives, and who better to know local biodiversity and local flora and fauna than the people who have lived there the longest. Also, this is a buildup of many global legislature that have been passed. For example, the Nagoya Protocol, which had been passed a decade ago now, how time flies. But the Nagoya Protocol was one of the first global pieces of legislature around data that took into account indigenous traditional knowledge and how to properly comply with indigenous laws and protocols. More recently, we have the FAIR and CARE principles, which are sort of guidelines on how data should be used in the future and sort of rules going forward. I'm sure some of you have already heard about this, but for those that have not, do a quick, are particularly important for this aspect and our project. So when we talk about FAIR, FAIR specifically talks about that data should be accessible to everyone. It should be findable, it should be usable, and people should be able to have access on it. Gerard said data is the oil of the future, and data is being collected from everybody. Everybody should be able to access data and use it themselves if they so choose. And that is what FAIR is about. CARE is a little bit more particular to our needs because it specifically deals with how data is used. And that is important because it specifically takes into account indigenous rights. It makes sure that data is used for the collective benefit, that data ecosystems in the future should be designed and function in ways that enable indigenous peoples to derive benefit from the data. Indigenous people's rights and interest in indigenous data must be recognized, and their authority to control such data is respected. They need to be able to be the right holders of that data. Those working with indigenous data have a responsibility to share how that data is used and support indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. And finally, ethics. Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem. So as we're building frameworks for agricultural data use and looking at this, these are definitely things we need to take into account. And now specifically, how does this all relate to our project? What do we do? Well, Enrich Local Context has created a system, a very elegant system, in my opinion, that introduces a new type of metadata. These are the traditional knowledge labels. Essentially, what they are is they are a little group of labels that attach to a piece of data, an artifact, a study, whatever it may be that you have. This is specifically when it comes to large-scale research, anything like that. They're labels that attach to it that sort of are designed to be human and machine readable. So you can search by a label if you want to find a specific piece of data that has a label attached to it, or are looking for specifically different pieces of data from a certain label. We're pushing towards the 5 A's on the screen that you can see here. But essentially, these labels each are symbols that represent a certain aspect of the data, and indigenous communities can customize the labels to suit their needs. However, the symbols stay the same. So, for example, a traditional knowledge label of attribution. Attribution can mean different things to different communities. So even though one piece of data might have attribution in a certain way, another piece of data might also be attribution, but in a slightly different way for a different community, so they can customize the description of those to fit their specific needs. They're divided into 3 different groups. We have the provenance, which is basically these labels state where this piece of data or research has come from, and it puts indigenous names back on the record. It also shows how the community relationships affect the data that is being shared. We have protocol labels, which is in reference to how to use the data and who can use the data, particularly when it comes to restricted or culturally sensitive information, right? And finally, permissions. This one's pretty simple. It's a different kind of permissions that indigenous communities would like when it comes to sharing knowledge. And you have examples on the screen, which is, can it be commercialized? Can it not be commercialized? Who receives the funding if it is commercialized, etc. And more specifically, how this relates to agriculture is we have a subsect of these that are biocultural labels. These reference traditional knowledge, sites of significance, and cultural monitoring. So let's say if a university is doing a study about how different plants grow or in a certain location, and they take some information from local indigenous communities, or they use a site that was sacred for growing plants for some reason, they would use these labels attaching to that study, and that lets other people know that, okay, yes, and this indigenous community was involved, they had a say in this, on how it was used, and so on and so forth, and it was sourced ethically. And yes, these specifically talk about flora and fauna of that are important to different communities. And to sort of show you an example of how this works in practice, I have an image here from the Library of Congress. This is a site showing an audio recording from the Passamaquoddy tribe. And if you'll take a look at the rights section there, the rights adversary, it says the rights are held by the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology and Harvard University. So before, the indigenous tribe who created this song didn't have the rights. The story behind it is James Pugh in the early 1800s made a recording on a wax cylinder to sort of test out this new technology, but he took recordings of indigenous tribe songs. They were stored in the Library of Congress, and the tribe did not have any say in how this was stored, used, etc. Right? However, local context was able to get in contact with the Library of Congress. They worked with the Passamaquoddy tribe and the library, and together they attached traditional knowledge labels to this piece of data. And this is what the site looks like now. As you can see, it's quite different. First of all, there's a description to the cultural significance of the song. There is the song in the specific language that of the tribe. And more specifically, you can see that the rights section no longer mentions Harvard University, because these one of the labels attached was the attribution label, which gave the rights back to the tribe. Now they have a say on how this data is used, how it is operated, and so on and so forth. And this just, does the song a lot more justice than what it was done previously. And what we're finding is that organizations more and more are pushing towards ethical use of data. As we've seen, as we've worked with different organizations, they've been looking back into their history records, seeing that, sometimes when data was collected or when research was performed, there wasn't necessarily an ethical approach taken to it for however long that organization had existed, whether it's a university or a private company. And now they're willing and open to working with our organizations so that they can redeem that and reclaim those aspects of data. And it is definitely something we need to consider when moving forward. So finally, I would just like to talk about how you can use it, because it's fairly simple, and anybody from researchers to large institutions can use these labels. Anybody can sign up, from a local farmer or a breeder that is using knowledge gained from the local community to do something, to a large company. Well, that example coming to my head, but previously from Jane's presentation, Monsanto. However, it is virtually for everybody. So let's talk about it, because we have tools specifically designed for a whole range of people, institutions, and researchers, anybody that's interested to disclose indigenous interests. The first thing you need to do is join the Local Context Hub. There's a link on the screen, and if people want, I can post a link in the chat afterwards from the presentation. But once you create a profile on this website, it enables you to join multiple accounts. And these accounts can be an account of your institution, of your indigenous community, or of just yourself, your personal research. And once these accounts will give you different permissions, either they'll give you the permission to create labels or create notices. So the local context projects assist in documenting cultural material on the hub. So institutions and researchers specifically have the ability to create notices. You can see example of one of these notices on screen. Basically, this is a notice open to collaborate. All you do is you put this on an article, on your website, on whatever project you see fit, a sample, here, I have a list. A sample, an item, an expedition, an exhibition, a collection, anything, and it'll notify indigenous communities that this organization is open to collaborate with this piece of data, this research. On the left, you see this is a genomic database called Genome, and on the right is an article taken from Simon Fraser University. And essentially, once an indigenous community finds the label and they say, okay, we'd like to collaborate, they can attach a traditional knowledge or biocultural label to that article. They can attach them themselves. And the label descriptions can be customized to suit the needs of the indigenous community. And the labels will then identify everything that is relevant to that indigenous community. And it's basically that simple. You create a notice, the indigenous community comes in, discusses with you how they want to move forward with their traditional knowledge labels, and then those labels get attached to the article or piece of data, and you have new metadata attached to it. So when you make this account, you can have 3 sort of different roles on like an institutional account, an administrator, an editor, and a viewer. And finally, when an institution and researcher has a label applied to one of their projects, it puts you in contact with the indigenous community that applied that label in case you want to discuss further, collaborate with them further, etc. So it's a great way for institutions and indigenous communities to get in contact with each other. And that is pretty much it. You are ready to go, and you can begin with your own research, other people's research, or introducing it into your own institution. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And that was, any questions?
Thank you, Dominic. This was the perfect presentation to close, because after the 2 presentations that were posing, let's say, challenges and problems, I think this is a very practical example, and it's really nice. I have questions, but I would say, shall we move to the discussion? Because we already have 2 questions in the questions and answers box. And I think these questions are, good for the 3 of you, for all of you. Oh, Marina here has a question. Yeah, I give precedence to the questions asked in person. Go, Marina.
Hello, everyone. First of all, Dominic, thank you for a very impressive work and for your presentation. And so I have 2 questions. So one question, maybe it will be related to how is the traditional knowledge labels fit into today's metadata standards? And another question, it will be how you implement fairness, because you mentioned that you use this fair principles, yes? And could you explain a little bit in details how you implement it?
Yeah, of course. So with the first, oh, sorry, did you have a little bit more to add? I think I interrupted you.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I think I interrupted you. Did you have a little bit more to add, or was that?
No.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so according to your first question, how does it fit into today's metadata standard? Well, that's actually a challenge we are still trying to solve. That's part of our collaboration, why Local Context has reached out to World Data Systems, because we work a lot in metadata standards around the world. Specifically, we do a lot of work in the Arctic program, but we are helping them implement these labels into current standards of today. Since it's not the best practice to create a new standard whenever new pieces of data are introduced, we are trying to see which current standards will fit the best. And of course, we're trying to actually change how the Dublin core, the one that is defines rights, permissions, and authorship, how that one works to include traditional knowledge and more inclusive of indigenous communities. So that's how we're tackling that issue. And when you're talking about FAIR, because these labels are machine readable, and because nowadays we are creating data so quickly at such an exponential rate, the fact that any search engine can be programmed to find these labels, any search engine can be programmed to look specifically for different labels attached to data, and they're so prominent when you look at the data, anybody can use them, anybody can find them, and will immediately know, okay, this is how I'm supposed to use the data, this is how I'm supposed to move forward, and it's 100% accessible to any indigenous community and any research or institution that might want to implement it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Because today the whole Europe is trying to implement this fairness in all aspects. But at the end, as I understood, that nobody knows what is the classical scheme of this fairness, because everybody explained from their side. So because of this, I had this question, and I'm interested in your approach in this related to this. Sorry, my guy enters. Okay, but I'm still here. Okay, thank you for answering my questions.
It was a good question, and yeah, it's definitely something we need to take into account as more people get access to the internet and more people become digitally literate, as Gerard said. How people have access to it when they don't have access to technology and so on and so forth is going to be a tricky challenge to do moving forward.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you, Dominic, for this. I would like to ask the question that Stephen asked here to the three of you, because all of you touched on engaging farmers, on participatory approaches and having the farmers participate in data governance. And so I think the three of you can answer this one. The question is, what are some effective strategies to engage farmers in matters concerning data management? And I would add data governance here, since your three presentations have a lot to do with data governance. Gerard, you want to start?
Well, okay. Thank you. What I would do is that I will try to link on some of the points that Jane made. Fantastic points, well thought of presentation, and I totally agree with some of the key messages that she brought out. And one of the things that she said is to negotiate data governance related issues for smallholders as a collective. Smallholder farmers by themselves do not have the capacity to be able to have that discussion, right? So if you're able to engage at a slightly higher level, a cooperative, a collective, a farmers organization, in trying to negotiate these data related agreements, then I think that's something that we can really build on, rather than, it's the question of next mile versus the last mile. If we always say last mile connectivity, we want to reach the last mile. It's not easy. It's quite difficult. So if you're able to engage with them at the collective, cooperative, farmers organization level, then I think we can do a significant engagement with them. Then over a period of time, maybe next 5 years, next 10 years, when situations improve, then you can start to talk about going to individual farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. Jane, what would you say to this?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with him on the points to negotiate with them on block. But I also want to add that other stakeholders, international governmental organizations, and even the multinationals themselves need to come to this realization that there is an unequal bargaining position between them and the farmers, and that they must consciously and intentionally try to reach out to the farmers in ways that would redistribute the gains of digital agriculture. It also has to come from that side before they move to talk with the farmers. Yeah.
Thank you. This resonates a lot with me, actually. At GFAR, we are conducting a collective action that is on inclusive digital agriculture. And that's exactly what we try to do. There has to be the participation from the farmers, and there has to be openness on the side of the other actors to include farmers in the governance, because the governance is the most difficult part, I think, of the whole data cycle. Yeah, Dominic, in developing these labels, I guess indigenous communities were involved.
Yeah, so that's actually one thing we have planned for the future of this project is actually performing case studies individually and working with the community. Like, how would this work in this situation? How would this work in this field? And sort of doing these sort of localized experiments with communities that want to get involved. But I know that there is a lot of mistrust, especially when it comes to small farmers and indigenous communities to larger organizations, and part of that rightfully so. But I think it is absolutely important that we look to these people as important sources of information and important sources of data, because one of the best ways where we can get data on very specific and reoccurring issues or problems is through the community and through community science. And I think opening up a lot of the data governance and rules and even methods that we use to collect, being more transparent, and working with them as sort of equals and not looking down from our, golden thrones, would I think definitely help build community trust in much larger organizations.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, the next question that Stephen has is very related to this, because you were talking about trust. And his question is, what kind of skepticism do farmers often express when it comes to data management or data governance? Who wants to answer this? Shall we do again from Gerard? Then...
Sorry, Valeria, I didn't catch your question, please.
The question is, what kind of skepticism do farmers often express when it comes to data management or data governance? Skepticism or lack of trust?
Yeah, I mean, there is an inherent lack of trust in digital technologies, right? Like I said, agriculture and rural communities is predominantly based on trust. Advisories is based on trust. The trust comes from a human face, not from an SMS or an app. So there's no trust in digital technology, and that's what I was mentioning, that we need to engage with the communities, with the levels and linkages that they have. And digital solutions could be an enabler. I'm not telling to completely replace what exists now. If you try to completely change it, you're going to break the system that's there in the rural milieu. So digital technologies, wherever possible, you can bring it in. And that also touches upon what Jane was telling about we trying to push an agenda. Maybe the messaging is not coming out clearly. What we are trying to do is, very clear that farmers need access to good quality information. 20 years back, there was a good breed of professional called as extension workers who used to bridge the gap between agricultural research and farmers. Now that particular breed of professionals is almost non-existent. Or in many cases, there is one extension worker for 4,000 farm families. So it's completely collapsed. So we are looking at digital technologies to bridge that gap to whatever extent it's possible. So the end result is to make sure that farmers have access to actionable, good quality, personalized information. And digital technologies provides an opportunity to do that. So our love is in getting the information to the farmers, not on digital technologies. So a little bit of clarification on what Jane was mentioning. Yeah, no, absolutely. The trust on digital is not there. And number two, if you see in most communities, when people get their first smartphones, what they do is exactly what you and I do, Facebook and whatever, YouTube, and they do not use it as much as we expect for livelihood related information and advisories. Yeah. And second thing is that the cost of access, still in several parts of the world, the cost of having internet access on your mobile phone is high for a rural community, right? And we need to keep all that in mind when you're trying to deliver services. I mean, radio is still relevant in most parts of the world. We're not even talking about radio. When we talk about digital technologies, radio is still relevant. Television programs is still relevant. Even a tuk-tuk where you have this big loudspeakers and you're blaring all these advisories and passing through the village, that's digital technologies, because the back end to generate that information that you're going to blare out is a knowledge base, which is digital technologies. So how you deliver the information has to be dependent on the community with a great sensitivity about who's going to have access, all the gender aspect and all those things. But the back end to generate that information all comes from digital. So to come back to the question, let's not push digital on farmers. What the farmers needs is access to information. How you do that, we need to play it based on the community, based on the individual, and based on the circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. Jane, your experience in terms of skepticism and mistrust from the farmers,
Yeah, so I try to flag a few, and I'll just emphasize on two at the moment. I had talked about lock-ins. And so when farmers adopt some technologies where there are unfair terms that demands that they must service the equipment with the manufacturer, you find out that and these repairs and maintenance costs much more than with the manufacturers than with independent repairers. So you find out that the farmers get very disenchanted and feel cheated. And evidence exists to show that a company like John Deere makes more money from maintenance and repairs than it makes from the sale of the equipment. So the farmers at the end of the day feel ripped off when they need to be locked in to repair with the same manufacturers. And the second thing will be the fact that these platforms are not compatible. So the incompatibility between the platforms also creates some kind of distrust amongst farmers, because they cannot now effectively move from one platform to the other, even when they are dissatisfied with the services of a particular company, because they'll have to lose the historical data that they have about it. So these are some of the issues they have complained about, and we need to look at if we're looking at designing a fair and a sustainable governance system.
Yeah, indeed, we haven't talked much about data portability, but that's something that's really essential. Yeah. And Dominic, the last word to you. In this case, it will be mostly the indigenous people, the communities with which you work.
Yeah, well, I really like both Gerard and Jane's answer. Gerard specifically about introducing things slowly and over time, I think is going to be important, because we need to sort of raise that trust level. And Jane mentioned in her presentation about how science has been used in both ways to sort of be helpful, but also manipulative, depending on whose views it's being used for. And I think that the best way to approach this, personally, in my opinion, and this amount of skepticism, because yes, we have experienced quite a bit of it, especially when we talk about that this is for research and for science and so on, is that when people don't have control over the things that they are giving up, like data collection is, increasing at a rapid rate. And when you give people technology, you're also taking a lot from them. And I think what's most important is to gain that trust back, is to give farmers and indigenous communities control over how they work with larger institutions, and how data governance is going to be applied in the future. Because when people have control over something, when people have control over what they're giving up and what they can and can't say, they feel safer. It feels like, okay, I have some power in this. I'm not powerless against this, so I can participate openly, right?
So with the labels, in the end, they realized that they could trust what you were doing. They were, I can imagine.
Yeah, we've worked with a lot of indigenous communities all over the world, actually, and it's still growing, and we're still gaining more collaborators and institutions joining our hub. But yeah, sometimes I actually attended a conference not so long ago where it was an interesting point of like some indigenous communities just don't have an interest in participating in data and so on and so forth. Like why should they care, basically? And I think that that's an important point that we need to think about, especially when we're talking to farmers or indigenous communities, is we need to show like why should they care, but still make sure that their participation is consensual and that they have some control in the process. Because we can't drag people into the system forcefully. They need to want it, and they need to want to participate. So we found that the best way to go about it is just through talking and education and saying like, hey, you know, this is a rather simple process, right? Like you don't need a background and 5 degrees to understand this. Like you can participate just as you are, right?
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, everybody. What I will do, I will share the recording. I will send you the recording and the presentations. And in the email, I will also include the contact address that to which you can write in case you're interested, because we were thinking, since we had 2 sessions on this team and there has been a lot of interest, there may be the opportunity of creating a working group in RDA. So if anybody is interested in creating a working group, doesn't require too much work. We can agree on a very short number of deliverables, discussions that we want to do. But our institution is interested. I think other organizations are as well. So I will also ask this question in the email that I will send to all of you. And if there is interest, we can think about a working group. And let me just publicize the next sessions. So this is again the program. The next 2 sessions are, one is tomorrow, and it will be led by Marina, who is with us today. And it's on experiences in Eastern Europe. And then there is another one on Friday on farm data for advanced analytics. Here is the QR code for registering. And this is all for today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Gerard. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Dominic. Thanks, Marcus. Thank you, all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
for inspiring
Thank
speaking.
you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
a
you.
lot.